Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Artemis, for inviting me here. Thank you all for being here. This is a subject, obviously, that's been buzzing around like crazy in the airwaves, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions around it. I spent a lot of time explaining how it works to people, this blockchain thing. I think that's important because obviously when there's a lot of buzz and a lot of hype, the tendency to kind of say, all right, well, everyone's talking about it, let's dive right in. Let's commit money and resources to this thing. And then, what happens later on is that you find out, oh, okay, this is what it does. Maybe we should have sort of did a bit of research before spending that time. So what I want to do today is I want to save you from all the research and all the hard work that I've done for about 6 years now. I have a software engineering background and I have an interest in economics. So this is something that appeals to me massively, especially as a technology. If it promises all these things, that it will change the world and it's going to reimagine and reinvent the way we do things, that appeals to me from a technological point of view. But obviously, a lot of you are not technologists. You have businesses and you need business cases before you can commit to something. So my aim today is to now demystify what's going on here. There's actually two topics here, and they're fundamentally different. The one is the blockchain, and later on you can see in the program I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin. So you might think, well, what's the difference? And I want to show you that they are two totally different things. Of course, blockchain makes Bitcoin possible, but Bitcoin has its aim is something that has the ability to change society, not just business and the way we do business. So later on today, I'm going to talk more about Bitcoin, what it means, why it's significant, and how it works. And I'm going to now spend this session talking about blockchain, how it works, and what are the potential opportunities in blockchain. And by the end of today, you can walk away from here being confident that you now know what it is. Maybe not from a technical point of view, but at least from its proposition, its value proposition, business or otherwise. Okay, so this is now the idea here is that we want to separate these two concepts. All right. Obviously, the Bitcoin aspect is going to build on top of what blockchain is and what it provides. But we're going to now leave Bitcoin to one side at this stage. Okay, so you can see the blockchain now, why it's called a blockchain, we'll talk more about later on, but at the end of the day, the concept of a blockchain is just this new kind of data structure. So if you've been using an Excel spreadsheet, if you've been using a SQL Server database or any kind of database, what the blockchain is really is just a new kind of database. It stores information in it. All right, and that's why it's called, well, the reason why it's called a blockchain is because the data that's stored inside a blockchain database is structured kind of like blocks of data that are all linked together. I'm going to explore that later on a bit more with you, but just think of that as a chain of blocks containing data, and that's all the blockchain is. But there's a lot of interesting features that it now gives us, specifically when it comes to sharing that information with others. Now, the idea and the hope that blockchain has is that it's going to decentralize a lot of the way we do things. Typically, in the world today, we have organizations that are the custodians of information, and their responsibility is to ensure that that data is secure, that it's correct. We've heard about the big data aspect. We've heard about security now just recently. Organizations have always been, throughout history, as long as we've had data warehouses, they've been responsible for storing information. We've had one single entity managing that. But what a blockchain does is it says, all right, we want to move into a world where we don't have to trust that single entity, that now we can distribute that information amongst multiple parties. And that means all the participants in that relationship don't have to now trust one of those participants to maintain that information. This is the promise of what a blockchain gives us, the ability now to decentralize and distribute all the data that is shared within some kind of ecosystem. Now, there's lots of kinds of blockchains. We see now that this idea of a blockchain is out there, it's quite simple to generate and create your own kind of blockchain. At the bottom there are different flavors of blockchain. Some companies are deciding that blockchains should be good at this sort of thing, and some think that it should be good at that sort of thing. Some organizations are creating their own kinds of blockchains. The idea now is this decentralized system. Now what can we do and how can we tweak it to suit our purposes? Now, the most important thing now again is a lot of people are saying that it's kind of like the internet again, where before we had this distributed network across the world where everybody could now communicate with each other and share information with each other. The idea of this database is the same. It's a database that can now be distributed around the world, or there's no geographic location that's required. And then that information that's stored in that database, that blockchain database, will be replicated around the world. So what I want to do now is I want to give you a use case, something that you understand, and it's a trade finance use case. So then you can start seeing what are all the features, what are all the important things that makes a blockchain database special. And the perfect example is a trade finance deal, because normally in a trade finance system you have multiple parties. They need to exchange information, they need to exchange value, we need to track items in a supply chain. So this is going to be a use case that you can now look at, and through this use case I'm going to highlight everything that makes a blockchain special. And then after this, you can now think to yourselves, all right, well, how can I use this in my own day-to-day life? And what are the potentials here? Now, by the way, every single thing that you've been hearing about blockchain, and people who know me know that I'm becoming less and less convinced that a blockchain is going to be something that is immediately going to be taken into your organization, change everything, the way you do things tomorrow. This is going to be still, I think, years to come where we can finally figure out what to do with this new beast. Now, the internet was like that, so don't think about a few years down the line as being so far in the future. Remember, 20 years ago, the internet wasn't much more than just a way to send email and to look at static web pages with very few graphics. And 20 years later, now we have things like Uber and Facebook that have changed our lives and consume us. So blockchain is kind of like that. It's going to be something that needs to develop, it needs to evolve, we need to find the right place to put it. What's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of use cases that come out of this discovery that we're going to be all excited about, but then we're going to realize, okay, wait, that's not such a great use case, and we can use existing technologies for that. But just like the internet surprised us, 20 years ago we had no idea there would be such a thing as social media. That was a surprise. Or that search would be such a big deal. Remember, in those days, I remember being a computer science student in the 90s. No one thought search was going to be such an enormous thing in our lives. And look where Google is today, based on search. So I think blockchain is going to be like that. We're going to try and apply it to business cases and use cases. We're going to find that they're wrong. And 10 years down the line, suddenly there's going to be all these new things that we never thought were possible or we ever thought that we'd need. And yet we spend all our time in them, like we do our social networks. Okay, so let me now give you this picture of a trade finance situation, and within that we're going to now see what makes a blockchain special. All right, and then we're going to talk more about the hype that's going on around it and what industry is doing with it. Okay, so when we talk about trade finance, it's quite simple, really. You have, if you can see right at the bottom over there, we've got two important participants here. One of the parties wants to buy something and they want to import it from some location, and then there's the other party which is now supplying that good or service. And these are the two participants. Now, typically in a trade finance situation, there's a lot of other participants that are involved. Like, for example, a bank. A bank usually needs to give a letter of credit so that the supplier knows that if they deliver the widgets according to some bill of lading, that's another document that needs to be created, then the supplier will know that they will get paid. That's the guarantee that they require. So we need a bank involved and some other parties involved and a lot of paperwork to be able to make sure that this deal goes smoothly in the world that we live today. So normally what happens is there's a contract that is signed, that is created. And on that contract, there's a number of things. If you can see them, it's very faint at the bottom. But what we have now is we have, let's call them provisions, or if it is a bill of lading, we have a number of steps that need to be fulfilled within this contract before the goods perhaps can be released, or in this case over here, the money can be released. So what a blockchain allows us to do is to be able to create the situation without the need for a bank to now get involved and issue that letter of credit. we can now create what's called a smart contract within a blockchain that runs autonomously. It ensures that all the provisions that have been specified on that contract are fulfilled and are honored. And then if they are honored, that smart contract, it's kind of like a little autonomous robot. It can then decide, all right, according to these provisions, I'm now going to release money to the supplier. So what happens next is that in a blockchain world, there's another concept of a value that you can now put into a blockchain. You can actually put money into a blockchain, or a token that represents money. So now, most famously, the blockchain that we know now about is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is all about money. You know, a new kind of token that represents value. But you can create your own blockchain for this particular situation, and you can say, right, here is a token that represents some money, and what we're going to do is we're going to load it into that smart contract. Now what we have is that the supplier can look at this contract and say, yes, these are the things that I need to fulfill. These are what I'm obligated to do. And there I can actually see the money sitting in the contract. And I know that if each one of those items gets ticked off, that money is going to come to me. So a bank isn't required in this particular situation. So now what we're going to do is we're going to see all the other participants in this chain, because they are all required to fulfill the obligations on this contract. So what we have next is, it's difficult to see, we're now going to be building up our blockchain. And what this blockchain is, remember I told you, it's a decentralized data store or a database that the participants that are involved in this relationship can all have access to, and they can view. So what we've got now over here is a smart contract built into this blockchain that is now autonomously going to ensure that the terms of the contract are fulfilled. And we have this database which is going to keep track of where things are and who's got what. All right. So what we've now done is we've created a little block or an identity on the blockchain. Identity is another important aspect of a blockchain. You can actually uniquely identify participants in a blockchain. So just like you have an account number at a bank that identifies your account, you can have accounts on a blockchain. And you can have value on those accounts. We don't call those accounts though, we call them addresses, which is like an email address. But now we have a blockchain address, which now you can use to restore value. And you can also use to keep track of items that you are now moving around. So what we're going to have next now is our supplier is going to produce that box of widgets, and there's the little box over there. And at the same time, we're now going to create a new token, which we are going to now, which is going to represent that box of widgets. We're going to assign that token to the identity, which is the supplier. And you can see now that that token is sitting in that block, which now represents the identity of the supplier. Okay. But now we've got a whole chain of supply over here. And part of the provisions at the bottom that were defined in the contract is that this shipping company now needs to pick up those widgets. So what happens is those widgets, a new block is created, a new identity. So you can see a second one is created on the blockchain. All the participants can now see that the token is sitting, or the widgets are sitting at the supplier. And what happens next is that the widgets move. And at the same time, we now say, all right, we're now going to move that token. We're going to move it, which represents the widgets, to the new, the shipper over there. And as soon as we do that, the contract at the bottom says, I've just detected that this box of widgets has now moved to this shipping company, which means now we're going to tick off one of the provisions on this contract. This is all managed autonomously. Once the contract is built, you don't have to have somebody sitting there managing all this information. This is what makes it really interesting, to be able to now have these autonomous robots, if you like, managing this whole process. Okay, and the supply chain goes on. We now have, let's say, a customs authority or port authority. That was part of the deal. The widgets, a new identity is created on the blockchain. The widgets then move. The token then moves to the port authority. Everybody can now see this immutable chain of ownership. We can now always know where in the supply chain that token is sitting. And we know its history. This has a lot of implications. If you think about potentially one day you going into the grocery store and you can say, all right, I want to buy these vegetables, or I want to buy this produce. I want to see where it came from. You might be able to now scan a barcode on that thing, and then it'll show you the history of where this item came from. And that might give you a lot of confidence. You can now know that it came from a source that you are aware of. Diamonds, for example, are being used in this case to know if they came from an ethical source. So this idea of provenance is now we have the ability to always know where things come from in this database. Another important thing is that it's immutable, which means once you've recorded an item or something, what's called a transaction in this database, it cannot be changed. So it's a very good way of storing where things come from, the provenance of things. So again, we're almost there at the supply. We now have a warehouse that those goods need to be shipped to. There they get moved. The token is now sent over there, and the third item is ticked off on the list. And eventually what happens is those goods move to the importer, and token is moved. The final item is ticked off on the smart contract, and the money moves. So this is now giving us all the ideas about what a blockchain gives us, all its capabilities. It has this decentralized distributed ledger or database that anybody who's participating in this arrangement can now access and look at. It's very transparent. It's very easy to be audited as well. It's immutable, meaning that once you put something into this database, nobody can go and change it. From a security point of view, that's very important, because we know that fraud can happen quite easily if somebody who's an administrator or somebody who gets into a database can easily change things. And then once they've changed it, it's very difficult to know, is this legitimate, or is this has the fraud been taking place? So a blockchain gives us that ability, this immutable ledger. It has identity, and we can have this smart contract idea, and we also now have the ability to actually record assets on the blockchain. And that token, by the way, doesn't have to be a physical thing. It could be a digital thing. And as Straight is now showing, they can now put securities on a blockchain, and that means you can do the same sort of thing and potentially one day make that whole process of trading securities much more streamlined, with a lot less risk involved. So this is essentially what a blockchain gives us, all those different features. And you can see now why there's kind of a lot of excitement in this space to say, all right, good, we can replace a lot of the existing systems that we have with a blockchain, and it will give us all these superpowers. But now people like myself who have been working with this technology for years, and also building POCs, consulting to banks and other companies, even though a blockchain is very interesting and it has these properties, a lot of them aren't really unique. If you want to think about decentralizing a system, then a blockchain is actually quite interesting. But I don't think that the world is moving into a place where we do want to decentralize everything. I think we're still going to live in a world where we have trusted organizations or intermediaries that manage things. I think that's a little bit anarchic to think that one day we're not going to have any intermediaries or entities that manage anything on our behalf. But if you do have a system like that, if you're saying, well, we don't really trust entities at this stage. We don't want to have to put our faith into a centralized organization which is managing parts of the system. Well, now what we want to do is we want to now disintermediate everybody and create this autonomous system that can manage all these things on our behalf. So that's where I think the potential lies from decentralization. Decentralization is a key concept when it comes to blockchain. If you are looking at a problem, a business case, and you're saying it would be really good to have decentralization in this case, then consider a blockchain. But actually everything that I've just described right now could easily be replaced with existing technology. I mean, if you think about a SAP system, let's say, for example, that all these participants now have access to, they're creating purchase orders and invoices and all that sort of thing. You could do that with the existing technology far more efficiently, but you wouldn't have now it's all centralized. And if you are thinking that that's not good enough, then perhaps you can consider a blockchain. What I want to do now is just give you all the kinds of use cases that people are, not all of them, there's so many use cases. There's a lot of hype, obviously, in this space. World Economic Forum saying that, it's going to become the beating heart of the financial system. Goldman Sachs saying it's going to change everything. I think that's overhyped, of course. But there are some use cases out there that people are now investigating, and they're putting real money behind it and seeing if blockchain can solve problems that were unsolvable before. So I'm going to give you a kind of overview and a survey of all those types of use cases so you can see where this is going. As yet, and I'm going to always caveat that when it comes to blockchain, none of these ideas really have been implemented in a production environment. As I said to you before, we're in those early days where there's a lot of promise, but at this stage, we haven't really seen a proper business case that says blockchain can do something that we could never do before, and now life is better. But let me give you a quick overview of some of those use cases. So, well, of course, the first one is payments. If you're thinking about a token on a blockchain that is distributed around the world, and you want to now move that token that represents money, it's very easy to do that in a decentralized way. Anybody can be a participant in this, and you can now send a token directly to that person. It's a peer-to-peer system. So it looks like that blockchain will be able to at least introduce efficiencies when it comes to cross-border remittances, maybe interbank settlements, that sort of thing. Again, it requires a lot of work in terms of compliance and regulation, and the legal aspects. Are you allowed to just suddenly move large amounts of money from here to China? So there's going to be a lot of work involved in this space, but to my mind, blockchain and particularly decentralized currencies like Bitcoin have a tremendous amount of potential when it comes to moving money across borders. We know how, Africa has the most expensive corridors in the world, up to 20%. With a blockchain, you could literally move R1 million to Zimbabwe. It'll take a few minutes, and it'll cost you maybe $1 or $2 to do that. And you can't doubt that is a tremendous potential. Okay, so payments to me is, and that's why I have it first, is to me that's where the most immediate potential lies and opportunity lies for blockchain. But there are others. Securities, as I mentioned, the ability to now digitize some share or something like that as a token. You can now potentially trade that in a peer-to-peer fashion. Again, a lot of regulation and compliance issues around that. Smart contracts, smart contracts are a lot of people are saying smart contracts might, make lawyers, redundant in some way, which to me isn't. Are there any lawyers here? No? Well, I can say it freely then. Well, that's not such a bad thing. But who knows? Obviously there's a lot of complexity when it comes to contracts. A smart contract is badly named. That's not really a contract. It's not a legal document. And also legal documents are complicated and ambiguous. That's why we need judges and lawyers to interpret them. All a smart contract really is a bit of business logic. So, it might make the legal industry more efficient. In terms of trade finance, it seems like there's potential there. But that's an avenue that's being explored. Okay, that's the legal industry that I talked about. The Internet of Things, at the moment, there's a lot of hype about Internet of Things, where our devices are now communicating with each other, with us. Sometimes those devices need to transact value, and you might not want to give your credit card to your fridge to buy milk if it runs out. So potentially we could now have Internet of Things acting value in terms of blockchain currencies. There's a lot of, in fact, the people who are involved in Internet of Things are saying that this is kind of the missing piece. We've needed this aspect. Also, as an identity thing. Remember, I mentioned blockchain has this concept of identity. So if we have billions of devices around the world, how do we uniquely identify those devices? Potentially with a blockchain address. That's one thing. There's identity. So there are companies now that are trying to reimagine Social Security or even passports, potentially creating digital identities that are universal. That's another avenue that's being explored. And then provenance was an important one. If you can see where something came from in a supply chain, very important. Insurance industry has a company called Everledger, which is doing that. They're recording diamonds onto a blockchain, and as it gets sold, that transaction gets stored in a blockchain. And if you have a diamond, if you purchase a diamond, you can now see where it came from, in case it's a blood diamond or something like that. This to me is a little bit more speculative, but apparently the health industry is interested in this. Having the ability for you to store your health data on a blockchain where you can now have control over it and reveal that information to people instead of having your records stored at some location. You can have control over who accesses that information. I know that to me is a little bit less likely, but that's what's been spoken about. And then maybe titles, titles to property. There are some companies that are doing this in different countries. They're prototyping things where you can have a title deed on a blockchain and as a token. And if you want to sell your house, you can just send that token like an email. If you sell your house, and again, conveyancing and all that takes time and money. There's a potential for you to do this. Have your land or even cars or something as a title on a blockchain and transact that in a peer-to-peer way. Government, there's a drive in some cases for government. One of the use cases is potentially with voting. There's a voting use case that's now being deployed in Estonia by NASDAQ, where and the idea here is, if you have an address and you're a candidate, and there's my opponent has an address, and I give every one of you one token, then you can all send that token to one of our addresses. We can all see in real time who is getting the most votes, and it's impossible for you to now send that token again to the other candidate, or send it twice, because once it's left you, it's arrived at the candidate. This could potentially disrupt the way voting works. Imagine if in South Africa we could now see up to the second and absolutely with absolute authentic data is accurate. We can see who of our candidates are getting the most votes. If any country does this, I can imagine countries around it being under a huge amount of pressure to do the same thing. If South Africa does this and some says no, well then everyone's going to say, well now we don't trust your processes. So this could potentially disrupt that whole thing, where we can have a lot more verification on how voting happens. Security. The security is being touted because blockchain, one of its most famous things that makes it special is that it's incredibly secure. It's very difficult to make changes to the blockchain. It's practically impossible to be able to amend the data on a blockchain. So maybe what we could do is we could have what's called a fingerprint of data. So let's say you have a document over here and you want to make sure that nobody changes this document. You can now create a fingerprint out of that document and put it onto a blockchain. And then later on, if you want to confirm that document hasn't changed, you can check the fingerprint, and if it's the same fingerprint in the blockchain, then the data hasn't changed. So this could potentially make things much more secure in terms of our data. And trade finance, that was the thing that I spoke about. And then finally, and most interestingly, and to me this is actually, even though the most far out, it's actually happening today, in terms of decentralization. I mentioned that the most important thing about a blockchain is decentralization. And if you think about Uber is a company that we all look at and say, oh look, well there's decentralization. Now drivers and passengers are communicating with each other and they're paying each other. But actually Uber is a very centralized system. Uber is acting as this glorified payment hub. Well, imagine this, if you could now pay your driver directly, then you don't need an Uber to now sit in the middle of that, this billion-dollar company, multiple billion-dollar company. That's what blockchain can do for us. Remove anybody who acts as an intermediary, which is facilitating payments. Now, that goes further than just an Uber type thing. If any of you have used Google Drive or Dropbox or something like that, this exists. I'm not going to talk about science fiction here. This is what works. This is existing today. Every one of you have a hard drive, and on that hard drive you might have a few gigs of excess capacity that you're not using. Also, you might have some RAM that you're not using and CPU cycles, all that kind of stuff. But imagine if you could kind of Airbnb your laptop. What do I mean by that? Google Drive, you pay Google Drive so they can give you a piece on their data center to store your files. Well, imagine if all of us came together in this room and we all contributed a gig of hard drive space to a big network. And that means now we could sell that gig of hard drive space to people who want to store their information online. So this exists today. You can now go and actually start storing your data on thousands of people's computers redundantly, so if one laptop shuts down, then it's available in another space. And what you do is you pay microtransactions to the people who are providing that service. So I think that what's going to happen in the future is that, not even in the future now, I mean, this is not the future, but more and more in terms of, more widespread, is that Google Drive is going to become redundant. And what about, and if you can do that, if you think about Amazon Web Services or these cloud hosting companies, where they're offering you processing power on their machines, well, you could now do the same thing. You could now offer maybe a small bit of RAM on your computer, which could contribute to a big pool of RAM, and that means now people could start hosting things. And I mustn't say could, because this is happening. People are hosting email servers, web servers in this big decentralized global network of people like us, and we're charging for that privilege tiny little microtransactions without the need of a credit card or a bank to do that. So I think that the disruption that's going to happen is not just going to be in terms of just payments itself and disintermediating the banking system, which when I talk about blockchain, Bitcoin, I think that's true. But centralized services that are offering digital services, I think Google is at risk here. I think Facebook is at risk because now you can have a decentralized social network. So those kinds of companies, the giants of the digital world that we look at and think they will never change, it'll never go away, and they're here forever. Blockchain is going to put a serious dent in their business case, and I think those are the companies that are most at risk in terms of blockchain. So it is exciting unless you're one of those types of businesses, but I think the disruption that's coming is going to be in that kind of way, not so much where now existing organizations like the banks or the insurance companies are going to now be able to take blockchain and reimagine themselves and make things more efficient and better, faster. And at the end of the day, don't really have much impact on the users of those systems. I think blockchain is going to have a much greater impact on that. It's going to create new industries or new businesses that completely make those redundant. So it's, disruption. I don't want to harp on the disruption, because there's so much hype around blockchain right now, but I think the hype is misdirected in a good way. Okay, so that's what the last little slide is there. Now, obviously, there's plenty of investment involved in blockchain right now. But remember, there was a lot of investment in the internet in the early days, and I think a lot of this investment is not going to go to waste because it's going to have developed a lot of people who now are skilled in this space, and then they can shift away. But of course, the hype is enormous, and there's a lot of investment. So I don't think we should think lightly about this. If there is any aspect of what I spoke to you about today that could potentially touch your life, then I think it's worth getting into it and looking at it, because you might be able to invent the next business of the future. So there's a lot of opportunity in that respect, and obviously blockchain, like the internet, probably one day will pervade our lives, and it is worth keeping an eye open for it, reading up every now and again, seeing what's going on, because the amount of investment is not trivial, and there must be a lot of smart people out there who expecting things to happen. And then also, we spoke about cloud, but it is becoming much easier nowadays to work with blockchain. You can just fire up an IBM Bluemix blockchain, or you can go into Microsoft and fire up a blockchain there as well. So it's quite easy nowadays to just, in a very low cost way, to get your IT guys to just go and fiddle around with blockchain and see what it's all about. It's becoming a lot more interesting. But now Gartner, that research company that we spoke about before, has identified a clear hype cycle with blockchain, and we're about over there, and I fully agree. I think that in the months to come, all this investment that is going in, by these banks and creating consortiums, I think they're going to realize, blockchain isn't all that. Everything can be done quite well with existing technology. So be prepared for this. Don't put all your eggs in this basket. But I do think that eventually we'll get to the other side, like we did with the internet, and there'll be a lot of amazing things that come out of this. Okay, so and then obviously now I'm going to talk more about this idea when we talk about Bitcoin, but Governments right now central banks specifically are thinking about blockchain in terms of a decentralized currency. So, whether or not this works it remains to be seen. When I talk more about Bitcoin, I'm going to talk about how this is, I think, misguided again. I think that there are some fundamental shifts that are happening today in the world from a global macroeconomic, geopolitical kind of view that is making the system that we know and love today, this sort of central banking system, seem less reliable and trustworthy. So, this is obviously an important thing for a central bank to be able to know that they can govern the financial aspect of a country. That's crucial for government to exist. But again, talking about the disruption and the potential here, the reason why I'm excited about this technology is not just because it's going to give us new tools to play with. I think we are on this kind of precipice or this edge of a cliff from a civilization even point of view. And I try and say that without sounding too much of this, airy-fairy type person. But, we definitely are in a very interesting time today. With what's going on in the world, there's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, but also a lot of financial uncertainty and a lot of over-indebtedness. And I think that, blockchain potentially, and in particular the decentralized currencies like Bitcoin, are going to not destroy the world as we know it, but perhaps save us from it in spite of all that. Okay, so that was pretty much what I wanted to discuss about blockchain. And when we get into the Bitcoin aspect, I'm going to dive more into what happens, how that information is stored, and also how you can now start interacting with it today. A lot of the work that's going into blockchain right now is in the labs. There's some companies that have these little secretive projects. There's a lot in the media about what they're doing and all their high hopes. But for most of us, that is all just kind of out there, and we're all just waiting for all this hype to kind of be realized. But there are ways that you can interact with it today. And I hope that when we get through the Bitcoin aspect, then you can now see that it's not just this Ponzi scheme, this bubble, this bubble thing. There's a lot of real practical applications for it as well. And also it's something that you can get your hands in today and start looking at seriously. So I'll be covering that later on today. But I wanted to leave some time for questions. I know I've still got about 10 minutes left. So if there are any questions around the blockchain aspect, I'd be pleased to answer them for you. Thank you. Yes?
The consideration that, in considering... Good. You said essentially it's just another form of database. Is it not only as good as the information that's put in? And is the weakness not potentially security aspects around what gets put and what transactions get recorded?
Yes, of course. I mean, any system is only as good as what you're inputting into that system. So blockchain isn't saying we're going to solve all those sorts of problems. And I think that's now why that hype cycle is coming to an end, because we're hearing all this inflated talk about blockchain, how it's going to just be this amazing thing. But of course, that trade finance situation that I gave you, that requires a lot for it to work. You need buy-in from all the participants. You need everybody to now agree to this system, and there needs to be applications built around it. So at the end of the day, that information or that system that you create, you may as well just say, look, we now have a new system, a new SAP system, for example, and everybody needs to get it involved. But again, it's not just a technology issue that we're facing with all these ideas. There's a lot of baggage that comes along with it, especially from a regulatory and compliance point of view. And also just from a technical point of view. I explained that trade finance deal as a nice way of streamlining this whole process, where a lot of what's done is autonomously done. But a lot of that requires a lot of further technical development. There's a lot of inefficiencies actually built into a blockchain, which makes it not suitable for general purpose information sharing. The whole idea of a blockchain is decentralization. So to be able to efficiently provide decentralization, you need to make it very hard for bad actors to come in and mess with that system. Because if it's decentralized, it means nobody owns it and governs it, which means that it now has a very large, what's called an attack surface or an attack vector. So a blockchain was built specifically for chaos. It said, we want to make sure that nobody controls the system and nobody governs the system. But to do that, we need to now insert inefficiencies which make it very expensive or complicated or difficult for those bad actors, and we know they exist, to want to come in and try and manipulate that data. So given the fact that those inefficiencies exist, it does make it much better as a secure system, because it's built for an insecure world. It's almost like being given a very strong immune system so it can resist all diseases. But because it's got such a strong immune system now, it doesn't make it, it makes it less efficient at some things. Maybe if it was a person, it's not, you can't run as fast because now you're loaded with antibodies or whatever it is. So yes, it's only as good as what you give it, and it only works well in terms of a system that is expecting there to be a lot of attacks. And by creating that kind of system, it now becomes less efficient. And so we're going to see now that even though there's a lot of use cases out there, that people are going to discover that it's more efficient to use existing technologies and to govern aspects of that so they can enforce security models around that exist. Yeah.
The other thing that we saw was that, if you look at the identity that you need to have on blockchain, if you look at the bank at the moment, the banks require you to have KYC. It's no different. And then the question that everyone always asks is, who's then governing it? And the whole purpose of blockchain is to not have a government.
Well, there's a very important aspect which I didn't touch on, which is this what's called a private versus a public blockchain. Now, a private blockchain, if you think about intranets in your company, you know that an intranet isn't accessible from outside, and only the people involved inside the company can have access to it. So what we see now is that, and this is the theme, is that if when we see organizations now creating consortiums to come together to make a blockchain system and see if it can work, what they do is they create it within their own internal network. So what they now have is the existing security infrastructure in place, which is protecting the outside world. But immediately now you can see why that is kind of, doesn't really make sense, because a blockchain at the end of the day was built to withstand attack from unknown parties. Now suddenly what we're doing is we're saying, all right, we don't like that aspect of a blockchain. We want to create a blockchain that only has known parties. And so we're going to do away with all this scary unknown stuff. But then suddenly now you will say, well then hang on, why do I need a blockchain again? Because the whole point of the blockchain was to create a system that is accessible from anybody and it can defend itself. So this is why a private blockchain, to me that's the bubble. I think that's the bubble that's going to pop, where all these private consortiums are now creating these private blockchains and realizing, hang on, it's way more efficient to do it with our existing. And by the way, distributed databases have existed for a long time. So a blockchain isn't about distributed data. Those exist, and I'm sure a lot of your companies already use distributed data and data systems. But the most valuable thing about a blockchain is the public aspect, where you can now expose it to the world in a chaotic environment, and you can know that the blockchain, just the way it's fundamentally put together, is going to resist those attacks. So now, again, I can't see the future, but as somebody who has built systems for 20 years, I've been building systems for banks and insurance companies, media companies, advertising companies, energy companies, and I know what it takes to build an enterprise system for something like a bank. And when I look at the blockchain, whenever somebody says, right, well, let's use one of these use cases, the first thing that comes to mind is like, hang on, we can do this already in a much more efficient way. So that's not to say, though, that blockchains won't work in that. I think it'll be short-sighted for me to condemn it immediately, especially since I've committed my entire life to blockchain. And I'm very eager to see how it can solve all these problems. But at this stage, there's a lot of what's called FOMO, fear of missing out. So there is a lot of emphasis in trying to understand this stuff. But I don't think it is a bad idea at this stage, if you don't have those resources, to just kind of wait and see. I think that is a prudent approach. Learning from others, will save you in the long run. And thankfully, we've got companies like Straight who are willing to do that and are innovative and thinking ahead and tackling this. And no doubt, they will find value at some point. And in fact, if they're not even now, and maybe they are right now finding a huge value, I must pry a little bit more. Thank goodness for those types of companies. Hopefully they'll reveal some of their secrets one day. But at this stage, as long as you are keeping your eye on it and having a look, you're not gonna at this stage miss out. I can guarantee you that you're not missing out at this stage. But again, the thing that I do believe in wholeheartedly, that I think is going to change every one of your lives, is the Bitcoin aspect. Now I know Bitcoin is a very sort of politically incorrect thing. When you're talking about a financial system outside of the say controlled financial system, of course, you're gonna rub people up the wrong way. But that to me, having been involved in this space for so long, it is now clear to me that is going to disrupt everything. That is going to change not just the lives of corporates and institutions and organizations, but every one of us in this room. And so that's why I wholeheartedly at this point in my life can speak openly and say, think of that, take that seriously. Now, from a treasury point of view, if it's money and you guys deal with money, well then somewhere along the line you're going to have to think about how do you incorporate that into your thinking. If people are literally storing their wealth in Bitcoin and wanting to transact in Bitcoin and wanting to send money to their friends overseas or their parents or wherever overseas and money, well then that's going to have an impact on Treasury, because now Treasury can think about keeping that idea. There's companies doing payroll with Bitcoin and trying to include that into that sort of world. So think of that. If you leave with anything today, and when I talk more about Bitcoin, you're going to see why I'm so bullish on it. Think about how you can think seriously about Bitcoin as maybe adding value in that space. I think you'll do well if you do that. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, so privacy is a very, very, very important thing. Now, this is why the whole idea of a private blockchain becomes a little bit complicated, especially within a banking environment or post-trade environment, securities environment, because at the end of the day, it is public, well, at least to the participants. So even though on a blockchain, you might not necessarily know the identity of who is receiving assets or money on that blockchain, you can still see the flow of what's going on. And if you have the ability to identify an address with an organization or with an individual, well, now you can suddenly see everything that's going on. So this is why the consortiums that we're finding now that are trying to introduce blockchains into the banking environment, there's a company called R3 that is trying to do this. They've realized that you can't use a blockchain in a world, in an organization that privacy is very important, and not just privacy, but opaqueness in some respect. If you could see that Bank A was transacting with Bank B, and that's no good. So a blockchain, again, it doesn't make sense in that environment. You need to put all these kind of controls in to stop participants from seeing other participants' transactions. So the consortium, the famous R3 blockchain consortium, which is no longer a blockchain consortium, they've said, we're going to build this up from the ground up. We're going to make sure that participants only can see the information flowing between each other and not everybody else. And we're going to use maybe the flavoring aspect of a blockchain, like we'll call what we're doing here with smart contracts, and we'll have cryptography. But at the end of the day, what they have found, and again, they've been doing this for more than a year, getting all these banks together to now investigate this. They realized blockchain is not going to work. So that's why this bubble, and we can look at them now and we can say they spent all this money, all this effort, and what did they find out at the end of it all? Was that blockchain doesn't work in that particular environment. To me, it just it proves again that a private blockchain is important. Now, why would a public blockchain? But now, if a public blockchain is transparent and everybody can see what's going on, then what happens if I have an identity on a blockchain which represents my account, and I have money in that account, and I want you to pay me, for example? Well, I'm going to give you that account number, that address, and it's going to take you 5 seconds to go onto a blockchain explorer and go and see how much money I have and see all the transactions in and out. So it doesn't work like a bank account. There are going to be new ways we have to think about how to use a blockchain and maintain our privacy. And there are, things that we can do nowadays to do that, and there are services that are coming into play. So yes, privacy very important. A blockchain is public and transparent by default, although it's not anonymous. It's what's called pseudonymous, which means you can see everything that's going on, but you might not necessarily know the identity of the people who are transacting. So that's one of the aspects of it. It's a new paradigm, it's a new thing. Also, by the way, and when we talk about the Bitcoin aspect, and I'll touch on it now, a lot of people say, listen, I mentioned the inefficiencies that are put into place on a blockchain to make sure that it's kind of uncrackable. Now, if you were to go and buy something with Bitcoin today, you probably find that your transaction, first of all, it doesn't settle immediately. It's not final. It takes minutes. It could potentially take half an hour. And nowadays, because there's a limitation on how many transactions per second we can have, it can potentially take days to actually move money from one person to another. That is not a good replacement for what we have today. If you go pay something with your Visa card, swipe the card, authenticate it, a couple of seconds later, boom, done. And also at a very low cost. Right now, Bitcoin is not low cost, and it's not quick. And a lot of people say, well, then it's never going to work, because how can it compete against these existing companies? Remember, this is now an alternative. What Bitcoin has created and the blockchain has created is an alternative system. And also, it's early days. So just like the internet once upon a time, back in the good old days was rubbish, it was slow, and there was not much on it. You couldn't do much on the internet, and you certainly wouldn't put your credit card information in, to buy stuff. We're kind of there with blockchain. We're still in the early days where we now have this sort of alternative system that isn't better than what we have, but it's different. And given, again, what's going on in the world, it's now becoming more feasible to think about it as, a viable alternative. So don't let the early days that we are in today put you off and say this is never going to work. That is obviously extremely short-sighted. It's like saying in the 90s, the internet's never going to work because I cannot stream movies efficiently. Yeah. Yes. They're very well. They're just planning. They're talking, and I know that they mentioned that they are thinking about a currency, but that's just because they are thinking about it. So they at this stage are engaging vendors and companies like mine and Straight to just try and understand what's going on. Also, they are thinking in terms of policies, that might be required, regulations that might be required. But at this stage, there's no business that is operating on a blockchain and exchanging money on a blockchain. So there's no, they can't really sink their teeth into anybody yet and say, what you're doing we don't like, and now we want to introduce a new policy. So they depend on us to now go ahead, which I'm pleased about. The whole idea of regulation follows innovation. That's sort of their thinking right now. I have a Bitcoin business, and we're open with them and telling them what we're doing and bouncing ideas off them, but it's still kind of informal. I think as all central banks are around the world, they're just waiting and seeing what happens, and if there are problems that come up, then they will then be able to make a decision. But right now, they are just they're having workshops like this. They have got some people there that are researching it and looking into it, and that's kind of the state that it is right now. But remember, a blockchain, especially in terms of currency, is by definition outside of their ambit. So it's going to be very difficult for them to insert themselves into a Bitcoin world. You cannot insert yourself into a Bitcoin world, but the places that they might be able to insert themselves are the businesses that are facilitating Bitcoin transactions on behalf of customers. So if you are taking money from somebody in exchange for a Bitcoin service, then they can at least enforce, typical KYC type or AML type regulations. But they are depending on us to now break that ground so they can pounce when they need to. Not pounce, but hold hands and guide. Yeah. Yep.
I think the first trade finance deal was done on blockchain and smart contracts late last year. Has there been a lot of volume since then?
No, those are POCs. It's very important. This is what's happening. All these companies are experimenting. The NASDAQ obviously has a private market on a blockchain and this voting thing, but they are very open about the fact that they're not doing a blockchain system because it solves a problem. They just want to learn. That's why they have decided to create a market on a blockchain, so they can figure it out and see if it's valuable. They haven't said, hey, this works great, let's go do it, it solves our problem. That trade finance deal, I remember Barclays, and was it cotton or cheese, I don't know, but that's what these companies are doing. They have to go and experiment, and they have to see how it works, and see where the problems are, and see if it does solve those sorts of problems. So we're going to continue to see these things that are happening, and I'll always look out for them eagerly, and I'm waiting for the day when somebody says, we now have a commercial thing in production, and it's saving us money, or it's making us money, and it's far more efficient and better than what we had before. But today, that hasn't happened. But of course, you're going to see this kind of experimentation, and it's absolutely necessary. But we're all looking forward to the day when somebody says, we did it. Hasn't happened yet. Although there has been a lot of cases of people saying, I moved R1 million to China and it only cost me $1 and nobody knew about it. Yes. It sounds scary, but if that's doable, isn't that amazing? Anyway. Okay. Yeah, sorry, this on the corner.
Just a quick question, or it's more of a comment. Blockchain, would it be more ideal in a procurement environment for corporates?
I can't tell you that. At this stage, you might be able to create a system that uses a blockchain in that particular situation, but whether it's better than what we have now, if you want to go and develop this, then and you can tell us later. But there are 1,001 use cases, 0 business cases. That's the status that we are in today, except the payments aspect. I'll keep on saying that. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.